I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today we're gonna make a climbing wall. As we continue to build out the room for my boys, we're gonna put in a climbing wall, and we're gonna put it right in this corner. That way we can have two separate walls and kind of an overhang. So the first step in doing this is figuring out all the measurements of the actual space so that we can plan how the framing is gonna fit in there. It's really important here that you get every single dimension, and in this particular case, one of the most important things is the pitch of the roof. So I need to make sure that I get that angle correct. And after I get all these things recorded, I'm gonna go into Fusion 360 and build a model of this specific space. Now, of course, you don't have to 3D model it. You could do that on paper just the same, but I like to be able to build it in 3 dimensions so I can easily modify things and see exactly how the framing is gonna need to be. It also helps me figure out how much material I need to get. I did a super quick sketch of the corner and recorded all of the measurements on that drawing. You can figure out the angle of this by doing some really simple geometry, but you could also use a digital protractor. This one's really cool. You just set it to 0 and then fit it into the angle that you want, and then it tells you the angle. Based on my 3D model, I figured out how many 2x4s and how many sheets of plywood I was gonna need. Once I got the materials, I started cutting everything down on the chop saw. I started by cutting down the base plate and the tallest straight pieces before working on the angles. I used a framing nailer to nail these pieces together because I have one, but if you don't, you can just do it with a hammer and nails or with a screw gun. I laid these pieces out in place before nailing them together and then measured the diagonal to the actual pieces. Sometimes a 3-dimensional model is not exact when you get to real-world building. And when putting these pieces together, I used a speed square to make sure that all the corners were square. For the diagonal piece, I used the angle that I'd found earlier to cut one side and then fit it into place and mark the bird's mouth for the other side. This was cut by angling a circular saw and lowering the blade to only cut to the right depth on each one of the passes. This fit right into place, and I used some nails to hold it onto the other parts of the frame. After the first tallest section, I spaced all the rest of the studs by 16 inches on center. That's a standard. Each one of these had to have that same angle cut at the top to fit against the top piece. Unfortunately, one of these studs was pretty bowed, so the whole wall rocked a bit. I used a belt sander to smooth out the back of it, and I had to do several passes to get it to lay flat. Up in the room, I marked all of the studs on all 3 of the walls that I was going to be attaching this to, just so I knew where everything was for anchoring. I also measured out the area where I needed to remove the trim on the floor, so that the frame could sit all the way against the wall. It was a nice tight fit, but to really tie it into the existing framing of the wall, I used some really long screws with some flat heads to drive it into the other studs that were already behind the drywall. Some of these screws were over 5 inches long, so they were plenty long enough to go through a 2x4, drywall, and into another 2x4. And after that one was firmly in place, it was time to move on to the next lower wall. This one was really straightforward because it didn't have any angles at all. It was just a basic framed wall, 16 on center for all the studs. I nailed this one together and put it into the wall the exact same way that I did the other one. With this one in place, you can see right there in the corner there are 2 2x4s that are facing each other. This is on purpose because you need a place for both of those plywood panels to connect to. I got this one bolted into the wall behind it and the wall next to it, but needed to add one more piece, so I had a little extra framing on the side. I put another 2x4 spanning this frame all the way up to the ceiling. This will eventually let me put some holds up on that little triangle. The last section of wall to make was for the angled ceiling, so that angle I found earlier was super important. I used it to make some bird mouth cuts on the end of 2x4s so that this section of wall would sit on the one below it. I did a test fit with my first piece to make sure that the angles and the openings were right, and had to make a couple of small adjustments. But after I had it fit, I used that one as a template to make the rest. You may notice that the framing here is not 16 on center, and that's because the joists in the ceiling are actually 24 inches apart. So I made sure that these matched the joists so that we could tie them together and make it really secure. After I had these all tied in, I found where the studs were on the actual flat part of the ceiling, so I knew where to drive in screws up through that top 2x4. Now there's no stud behind this for me to tie into, but I'm putting this here to support the plywood that's going to be on the front of this. It's a pretty long gap, it's 24 inches, and that's a little bit much for you to be pulling on with a hold, so having an extra little piece of support here is going to support the plywood across the span. I knocked those pieces in and nailed them into place, and I did have to use some shims to make sure that everything was really tight. I didn't have a great plan for the air conditioning duct in the wall, so my first thought was to extend it out to the face of the wall with a little 2x4 frame. I also made a little box to put around the plug that was in the wall that we could actually use as a handhold. That way we could still access the plug when we needed it. And with that, all the framing was done, then it was time to wrap the whole thing in a whole lot of plywood. The next step here on these panels is to make a bunch of holes so that the handholds can be attached. Each one of those handholds gets a bolt that goes through it and it goes into a T-nut. So we have to drill holes for these to go into. And to drill those holes to make sure that they don't intersect with the frame behind it, we're going to draw out a grid that's 8 inches by 8 inches from side to side. I started drawing these out and it dawned on me that if I start at the bottom of the panel and do every 8 inches, the top row is actually going to hit the top edge of the panel because it's divisible by 8. So instead, we're going to come off 6 inches from the bottom and then do every 8 inches. That'll give us an extra row of holds on this panel. I picked which side of the board I wanted facing out and drilled the holes from that side with a backer board behind it to cut down on blowout. Then we flipped it over and hammered in a T-nut into each one of these holes. The T-nuts create a threaded insert in each one of these holes so that you can drive a bolt through a climbing hold into that thread. Originally we were just going to cover up the plug that's on this wall because we won't really need it in this particular situation, but rather than covering it up, I decided to frame in a little box and just turn it into a handhold. And I was going to cut it out to the geometric shape of the 2x4s behind, but instead just did it curvy and it looks a little bit more organic. So we'll sand it down, it'll be good to go. I ripped out another sheet of plywood to fit at the bottom of that wall and then put on the same grid, drilled the same holes, and drove in the same T-nuts. But before I put this one on, I knocked out the framing that I had put around the AC vent. I changed my mind and decided to put the grate back on and then just cut out a hole to let the air blow through the wall. I did these two cutouts in the wall kind of out of necessity, but there are a lot of different climbing walls that use this type of thing for a lot of the holds. The piece of plywood for the angled part of the ceiling was done the exact same way, except it had an angle cut on one edge. This is so that it'll butt up against the straight wall and not have a big gap. We made the rest of the plywood panels in the same way and just screwed them on, using lots of screws to make sure that everything was really secure to the framing. The offcut from the sidewall actually worked as a cover for the outside edge. I was able to cover up all the 2x4s with some strips of plywood just to dress everything up. Obviously, these pieces can't have T-nuts, but there are some climbing holds that you can attach to a surface with regular screws. The construction for this thing is all finished. Now there are a few details before we can start putting the holds on the wall. One, I need to sand off all the edges and sand these cutouts so they're not hard on your hands when you're holding on to them. Then we're gonna put on one coat of finish. Temporarily, we're gonna put on a clear coat because I'm not really sure if we're gonna paint it or what we're gonna do long term. So for now, we're gonna put a couple of coats of polyacrylic. That'll protect it until we decide what to do with it finish-wise long term. This thing is a blast. We've been spending a lot of time on it and our kids are already becoming better climbers. There's a certain amount of risk with climbing and with building things that you climb on, so you have to decide the amount of risk that you're comfortable with for you and your family before you build something like this. But if you do build one of these and you also want to learn how to make your own holds, I've got a video on how I made this one right here. You can check that video out right over there, as well as a whole bunch of other project videos of all different types. Don't forget to subscribe as well and to the second channel. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. That should be good enough to keep it in shape while we get behind this one to tie into, but the big reason